So, if you've been wondering what's happening to the world, why has England, for example, voted to commit suicide by leaving the European Union? Or why has Britain voted to commit suicide? Why are the English in particular trying their very best to show they are as dumb, if not dumber than the Americans, who've outdone themselves by voting for Donald Trump as the presidential nominee of the Republican Party? I mean, Donald Trump, he makes even our politicians look good, and that isn't easy to do. So much is happening around the world that it all seems incomprehensible. What's going on? Is there a right-wing, anti-immigrant backlash? Or is it more complex than that? All this change and impermanence, is that got an economic basis? In fact, much of what's happening may be following a pattern of global trends that this book has in great detail and mastery documented. The book is called The Rise and Fall of Nations, and it has smashed into the New York Times list of bestsellers, which is, believe me, a huge achievement. For even some of the best publishers in the world, for them, less than 2% of their books actually enter the New York Times bestseller list. The book is written by Ruchir Sharma. Ruchir Sharma is with Morgan Stanley, and he alone controls tens of billions of dollars worth of investment funds around the world. That's more funds than India's government budget expenditure. That's saying something. In this book, Ruchir Sharma has combined his years of personal experience, of course he's a young man, so not many years, on the streets of dozens of nations around the world. He's interacted with leaders and of governments around the world, and he's met with CEOs of hundreds of the world's top organizations. Now this book, it is an amazing read. I really learned a lot from it, mainly from its out-of-the-box thinking. It's not the usual economist terms of trade and, jargon. It actually lays out 10 rules to check or to predict whether a country is going to rise or fall, or whether it's going to hit turmoil, like England just did with Brexit. Today, while we look at the patterns across the globe, we shall obviously pay special focus on whether India is going to rise or fall and why. So we have a lot of ground to cover. We have the whole world, we have India, and we're going to really squeeze every bit out of this book. So let's get started. Just to put the global pattern and Brexit, is that something out of the ordinary, or is there a pattern in that?
Well, if you really look at the world, it was severely disrupted by what happened in the global financial crisis of 2008. And even though that is 8 years in the rearview window, we are still feeling the consequences of that. And Brexit, in many ways, is something that is the biggest manifestation of the trends that have come to dominate this decade. In fact, everything that we believed about the world last decade has now been turned on its head.
Right, and I remember you saying that a kind of recession happens every 7, 8, 9 years. So 8 years, and we're looking for trouble already.
Yeah, that's right. This is an aging cycle. And so therefore, we are on the lookout for as to what can go wrong to trip it. There's no science behind this, but that's what it is. Earlier in the year, it was China, and now, obviously, the risks being thrown up by Brexit. But really, I think the key thing here is to focus on what are the big trends that are defining this decade and what explains why Brexit happened.
So one of the factors that you mentioned, and we've got a graphic on this, is a global revolt. It's like throw the bums out. People want change. And we've seen that approval ratings of leaders, and what you've done beautifully in the book is to talk about BC and AC, before the crisis of 2008 and after the crises. So BC approval ratings of top leaders of the major countries around the world were over 50%, and they've just declined to 40%. So is Brexit part of this global revolt?
Yes, I think so, because I think that what's happening here is that we created this index of the 20 of the world's largest countries to see what's happening to approval ratings of leaders. Right. And those have been slipping and in fact are at all-time lows just now, if you look at the average approval ratings. And so in some way what's happening across the world is that there's a huge anti-establishment wave, what we refer to in India as an anti-incumbency wave.
People want change.
People want change, and whoever comes in the way is getting swept out. And there's no pattern. Like in Latin America, for example, you have more business-friendly and market-friendly leaders who are coming to power because the left was in power in Latin America. Whereas in places such as
So it's not just
UK,
a right-wing backlash or a left-wing backlash. Whoever's in, they want out, and they want somebody else.
Yes, that's right.
The other point you mention is, in this post-crisis change, is the world is turning inwards. Countries are looking inwards. The gross domestic product growth rates have fallen from near 3.5% to 2.5%, which is huge, very significant. And that is accompanied by a huge decline in trade, global trade, from a growth of 8%, many times multiple of the GDP growth, to nearly 0%. So countries are looking inward. Is that also what England is doing?
Yeah, because that's the new buzzword across the world now, which is deglobalization. We all grew up in the 1980s, 1990s, and the 2000s thinking the world's going to be more integrated. Tariffs came down all over the world. It seemed as if trade was always going to increase between countries. Capital flows were going to increase between countries. Right. But what we're seeing now is exactly the opposite, which is that trade has collapsed. It's now growing at much less than global GDP, which has not happened in a generation. Capital flows have collapsed. And
capital
protectionist measures.
Investment money going across from one country to another.
Yes, or
that's
banks
down
lending
as well.
beyond their borders.
Banks lending beyond their borders.
That's turned much more inward now. And most significantly, protectionist measures have gone up everywhere. So there's this cry for much greater protectionism. Right. And India really has been at the forefront of that as well, in terms of the number of protectionist measures that India has instituted in the AC world. Right. So I think that that's something which we're seeing, that deglobalization is the new buzzword.
And in a way, Brexit is deglobalizing, looking more inwards, not worrying about trade, etc. A third global factor, which kind of explains this pattern in your book, is how income inequality is exploding. Before BC, before the crisis, there were 1,000 billionaires in the world. AC, after the crisis, where actually things have slowed down and you think there'll be fewer billionaires, there are 2,000 billionaires. It's doubled. I mean, that is a huge explosion of income inequality.
Yeah, income inequality has really come to be like another defining term of this decade, because if you look at it, it's been rising steadily since the 1980s, but it's really been turbocharged after the global financial crisis, that as there's been a lot of easy money spread across the world, the people who have really benefited the most from it are the rich. And look at what's really happened in UK as well, that if you look at the voting patterns of UK, the saying that we have is that, show me where is the wealth and I'll show you where is the vote, which is that all the wealthy places in UK, like London, voted to remain.
Yes.
And all the other sort of regions, the poorer the region, the greater was the vote in favor of leaving UK. So I think this is really a revolt also taking place by the middle classes and the poor people who really sort of are saying they're not benefiting from this very mild economic recovery that's taking place.
Get out of here.
Yeah, they won't change.
So that is a broad overview. Can we now look at your 10 rules globally, and how does India fit into each one? We go very quickly through them because it's very important to understand India in the global impermanence, the global change. First point you raise is the depopulation bomb that the world is facing. In fact, the population growth rate has dropped over the last 50 years from 2.5 and over 2.5% per annum population was growing at, is now 1%. That's a huge decline. That means population is hardly growing now compared to what it was earlier. And at the same time, world GDP growth rate has dropped from 3.5 to 2.5. So population slowdown is affecting growth rates.
Yes, because there are two drivers of economic growth in any country, in fact, in equal measure. One is the increase in your labor force, and the second is the increase in productivity. Right. Now, I think there's a lot of discussion as to why productivity is so low. There are people spending a lot on meaningless applications and that kind of thing, or whether we are undercounting it. But what's happening on the population front is, I think, underappreciated. The fact that the working age population of the world is falling. There are, in fact, now 30 countries in the world where the working age population is shrinking, led by China. So some very major countries in the world now are seeing a shrinkage in their working age population.
So in the old days, we used to talk about sterilization, cut your population growth rate. There's a huge rethink on that. And if you look at what your book says about India's role in this overall pattern, India, in fact, scores quite well on the population front. The Philippines is about 2%, India is just under 2%, while the average for emerging markets or for the world is about 1%, as we just saw. So India is well above average. So is that a positive for India?
Yeah, as I say in the book, that population of an increase in the working age population growth is a necessary but not sufficient condition for high economic growth.
Right.
So at least we have some necessary condition in place for high economic growth. Now, as we know, we have had high population growth in the past, and we haven't been able to convert that into high economic growth always. But it's a necessary condition that when countries, let's say, have a shrinkage in their working age population growth, their average growth rate tends to be just 1.5%. So the fact that India is seeing an increase in its working age population growth is a positive for this country, particularly at a time when so many countries in the world, led by China, are seeing negative changes in their working age population growth.
Fascinating, a complete rethinking of how important population growth is. Moving on to your second rule, which you call the circle of life.
Right.
That nations go through 4 stages, and they keep going round and round in these 4 stages. They start with a crisis. Then the leaders wake up and they actually effectively impose some reforms. That leads to a revival. Once the revival takes place, the leaders say, oh, we're doing fine. It leads to complacency, and then back to the crisis. So in that sense, if we look at what kind of leaders, what kind of change one needs in leadership, you also mention that it's better to have new leaders. Don't have the same leaders on for 2 or 3 terms. In fact, amazing statistics that when a new leader comes into any country around the world, and you've studied so many of them and got all the data from that, 90% of their benefit, at least in terms of measured by the stock market, which is a kind of, in the end, the final analysis, 90% happens in the first 2 years. 10% happens in the next 3 years. So in their first 5 years, they've done everything. Right. The next term, they come in 0.
Right.
And the third term, if they ever come, negative.
Right.
So you do want new leadership all the time in countries around the world. Change.
Yes. I think there are 2 points here. One, that most countries only carry out economic reforms when their backs to the wall. And that's particularly true of emerging markets. There are about 200 countries in the world today. 35 are classified as developed. The rest are classified as emerging, and many have been emerging forever. So like Brazil, for example, is as poor today compared to the United States that it was 100 years ago, because most countries are stuck in the circle of life, which is that they only reform when times are bad and good times they don't. The few who do are able to break out of this pattern. But I find the second graph as part of our analysis here to be really fascinating. And this really confirms the fact that you want new leaders to come to power, that even if a leader does well in his or her first term, by the time the leader gets into the second term, the voters may elect it back based on the first term, but very rarely are they able to repeat what they did in the first term to the effect they did in the second term.
And you see this again and again around the world. You're seeing it in Turkey, and now the third term. You see it all over the world.
Yeah, like Russia. Right. The Putin that I sort of met into at the early part of last decade was very different than the Putin of 2010 that I saw then. So I think that this happens with leaders.
How come these leaders just hang on? Don't they see the
there's an old quote that in the end, every hero becomes a bore. And I think that that's really what happens with leaders as well.
Happens in media too, right? Okay, the third rule, which actually is really thinking out of the box and so different from economists, is does inequality threaten a nation? And you looked at the billionaires' wealth, the billionaires around the world as a share of GDP, like in each country and globally. And if you look at billionaires as their share of the wealth around the world, on average, it's just under 10%. 9% of the wealth of billionaires. Billionaires have about 9% of the wealth of any country. Now, if you look at India and other countries, in Japan, billionaires really low. It's 2% of the wealth of Japan. China, it's about 5 or 6%. Well, India, it's coming up to 15%. That's way above the average. America is also roughly 15, so India and America are similar, but there are differences which we should go into. And Russia, 18%. So India is more unequal in a sense. The inequality threat is very high in India.
Yeah, at the top. I think that's what's happened. But what I try and do here is to really look at these billionaires lists to figure out that when is a country going to turn more hostile towards wealth creation. Because if you have far too much concentration of wealth at the top, that's
Then
when
they
you end
start,
up getting a sort of attitude in the country that, that the society is a bit unfair out here. And there are three vectors I look at. So the first one that you spoke about was just the share in terms of it.
Now
The
you
second
also
one,
look at what share of billionaire wealth comes from corruption-prone industries. And you find in India, the share of billionaire wealth is 30% from corruption-prone, where you need government contacts, you need licenses, you need all that sort of stuff. While the world average is 25%, Japan again 10%, US just 10% comes from corruption-prone, Russia 70%. That's one of the qualitative factors you're talking about. The second one you write in your book is the self-made versus inherited billionaire. Obviously, people respect self-made billionaires much more, and you don't get that anti-wealth feeling as much. Now here, the world average is about 40%. I thought that was remarkably high. 40% of billionaires are inherited. And in India, it's 60%. Korea, 80%. But again, Japan and US lower than the world average. So India, again, is in that area where people might start resenting wealth creation that you're talking about. This other thing I think is really out of the box, Ruchir. Good versus bad billionaires. A good billionaire in India is making a comeback, but there was a time when bad billionaires were dominating India. But say like in 2010, 22% of Indian billionaires were good, only 22%. That means 78% were bad billionaires. And 53% today are good billionaires. That's a huge and encouraging change, right?
Yeah, it's the decline in crony capitalism in India, which is happening at the margin, because this is a rule that I really learned in India. It's like, at the second half of last decade, when there was massive wealth creation going on in India, you could make out that a lot of it was happening because people were gaming the system, whether it was for license or other things. And so this is something that I really learned out here.
Explain that good versus bad a little clearer.
Yeah, so I think that as far as my definition is concerned, the good billionaires are the kinds who create their wealth in industries such as technology, manufacturing, pharmaceutical, which is really industries which are where something has to do with innovation or to do with something that is starting from scratch. Whereas the so-called bad billionaires, and not everyone's a bad billionaire, but it's the balance which matters. Those are industries that tend to be much more corruption prone. Often it can be real estate, it can be mining, it can be the commodity businesses, or where some government license is involved. So the issue is that any country is going to have some billionaires from all these sectors, but the balance is key. And India was badly out of balance at the turn of this decade, but in the last few years, the balance is once again turning at least
towards good billionaires who,
towards good
by
billionaires.
hard work and by entrepreneurship
are moving ahead.
In fact, they're more than half now, which is a really good sign. The other thing, in just staying with this, not quite billionaires, but about crony capitalists, which you just spoke about. You're saying that in India, crony capitalists, these are people who've made money through government handouts, basically of various types, under and over the table. Crony capitalists finally are not doing well. If you look at it, between 2010 2015, the Indian stock market has gone up 50%, but the crony capitalist companies, their value has gone down 50%. Now, that is just a huge spread.
Yeah, that's right. And again, turning everything that we
believed
about last
crony
decade.
Capitalism.
Yeah, crony capitalism is the same thing about bad billionaires, about people who are creating their wealth basically based on government connections. So if you try and sort of identify those companies and see as to how their value has done, it's done much poorly. In fact, in India, there's been a real rush towards quality companies over the last decade. That's what investors are backing now.
That is
a positive change.
A major positive.
That's right.